Hello, I'm JP Noodleman and welcome to my channel. Today's topic is why the rules matter, or why the rule system you use for your uh, homebrew D&D campaign setting, or homebrew D20 or whatever you're going to use at campaign setting will matter when you design your world. Now, um, the what I mean by that is that the rule system you choose to actually have govern the game you're going to play in your campaign world that you've designed will affect the nature of the world. So, for example, there might be mechanics, classes, just certain features of how the classes work that will determine just what it is your world is. So, for example, say you're designing a world, just a generic fantasy world, and you're going to use 5th edition rules. Those are currently the current edition of Dungeons and Dragons by Wizard of the Coast, and you are just going to straight up put it in there. Well, first of all, that means your world has to have the races elf, wild elf, wood elf, or whatever, drow. You have to have dwarves, gnomes, tieflings, humans. All of those things are now caked into your campaign world. Without any alterations, you've now essentially picked a host of gods, what races are in your world, um, what classes are in your world. So not only is cleric isn't just some generic word for a preacher or priest or priestess, it's now a specific kind of person, an armored uh, agent of the faith that can actually conjure literal manifestations of their god's, divine power in the world. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but if that wasn't what you wanted your setting to be, you obviously need to make some changes. So, continuing on with the 5th edition example, so let's say you do want to make those changes. Um, you're going to quickly enter a battle with yourself between your willingness to homebrew new what they call crunch, i.e., mechanical rules to help make the 5th edition rules more like what you want your world to be. So, for example, in one world that I made, I just did not like the way Druid worked because that wasn't what I wanted Druid to be. I wanted Druid to be more like the historic Druid, which is more like a scholar. In fact, honestly, it's more like what a wizard kind of is, or an archivist if from the Heroes of Horror splat book. But it just became a constant struggle because everything that I needed to tweak involved taking time away from writing lore and inventing regions and quests and trying to alter and modify the rule set that I was using. So you are going to have an issue if you're going to use 5th edition because, well, there's a lot of good reasons to use 5th edition. Excuse me. It's the edition that everyone is familiar with. It's the edition that everyone has, well, not everyone, but it's an edition that most people have heard of. The source material is out there very readily. The handbooks are easily acquired. It's a very easy system to get into. Um, there's 3.5 edition, Pathfinder, 4th edition, although I personally have never used that one, but I'm sure people have. And then there's obviously 2nd edition and before and all those. And then there's lots of little OSR clones and things like that out there. So you have a lot of variety of what kind of edition you want to use, but you're going to want to think about what edition of rules, what set of rules are going to govern the game in your homebrew world, because again, it will affect things. It will affect the logic of your world. So, and to give another example, I have a friend who wanted to make a campaign world that was a bit more Game of Thrones style. Now, this is when like first season had just come out on HBO, and everybody was rushing to read the books if they hadn't already read the books up until that point, and it took off like none other. And he wanted that style of world, but we were using Pathfinder's rule set. And the issue with Pathfinder, with any um, D&D edition is magic. So he wants a world with intrigue and plots and political maneuvering, which is hard to do once the players start getting spells like Zone of Truth. Once we start getting candles of truth telling and things like that, you end up with a campaign world that, although you intended it to be one thing, ultimately isn't that thing. And it just sort of quickly became a generic high fantasy, go up and smash up the giant, evil, horrible monsters. So right there was a design intent. This is what the world was supposed to be like. But then obviously the mechanics of the rules dictate what kind of quests you can make, because if the players can easily find out if someone's telling the truth or not, or who's accurate, who's honest, or just the mere fact that the gods can be summoned forth with magical powers to do whatever you need, you're going to be having to mold your setting to fit that. So you have these two situations. One is that you might have an intent for a world that the rule systems that a lot of people, that a lot of rule systems just don't work with. Or you might have a design concept that you want to homebrew, new mechanics, but then you're basically trying to reinvent the wheel. At that point, you might as well invent uh, your own game. You might as well just rewrite the whole thing at that point. So my advice is honestly, research out what kind of rule system you should use. Don't just go with necessarily what's most common. So right now that would be like 5th edition Pathfinder 3.5 are very, 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 very common. They're frequently played. Many people have heard of them. They're everywhere. And, it's going to be kind of easy to find players for that. But if you're a world builder and you kind of want your world to have a certain aesthetic feel, you're not going to be able to do that with the confines that a specific rule set are going to apply to you. So, for example, I've found one called Low Fantasy Gaming. I previously had tried basic fantasy RPG, but there were some technical problems with it, both in terms of the character sheets on Roll20 weren't very well designed. They had a lot of glitches, and also I just found out quite quickly that the way the classes were built and the way the actual mechanics of gameplay work weren't really to my liking. So I'm going to give this new rule set that I found called Low Fantasy Gaming a shot, because my world is low fantasy. It's intended to be more like a Conan the Barbarian, maybe a little bit of that Song of Ice and Fire feel to it. And, the rules kind of suit. So, there's only basic classes: Barbarian, Bard, Fighter, Magic User, Rogue. Magic User being a very non-specific type of class means that, in one cultural region, a magic user might be called a druid. In another, they might be called a wizard. In another, they might be called a sorcerer. I have that advantage of, if a NPC says, oh, the sorcerer of blank, it's not a specific class that then the players automatically know the mechanics of. It's just a magic user in this setting that could be any kind of magic user with any, set of spells in the, to their knowledge. Also, the advantage of specifically the set of rules I'm looking at right now is there's no cleric class. There's no domain powers. There's no divine specific class. So right there, that means that my world has gods that are somewhat detached, if they exist at all. The gods aren't directly interacting with the world, as opposed to a 5th edition world or a Pathfinder world, a world where those rules apply. The gods are by default have to be more invested in the world, so as to justify the cleric class and maybe the paladin and things like that. Whereas in this set of rules, you're going to have there are methods of healing, but there's not going to be the same sorts of classes, and even the classes as you see them here are not exactly what they typically are in, say, a 5th edition 3.5 or Pathfinder game. So I think that that's the way you should go. If you're a world builder, you need to put your design aesthetics first before necessarily the game's mechanics. That's not to say that game mechanics shouldn't be on your mind. It's just you shouldn't be so wedded to a set of game mechanics and then, unless of course you just want to play a 5th edition game, but you want to homebrew a kind of interesting setting with 5th edition, that's perfectly fine. I would never criticize that. It's just sort of you're homebrewing this very elaborate world, and the 5th edition or Pathfinder rules don't quite work for it, but you're going to use them anyway. I think that just kind of clashes with your design setting, and it kind of forces your design aesthetic, I mean, and it doesn't allow you to do what it is you actually want to do with your homebrew world. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you have to say. I'd love to hear from other world builders, other dungeon masters, and let's get a conversation going. Have a good day. Happy building.